Picture this. You're standing in a museum, staring at the skeleton of a ground sloth the size of an elephant, or maybe the fossilized remains of a beaver as big as a black bear. These weren't mythical creatures or Hollywood monsters. They were real animals that roamed our planet just 15,000 years ago. Now look around you today. The largest land mammal you're likely to encounter is a cow, maybe a horse if you're lucky. What happened to all the giants? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most dramatic transformations in natural history, a story that connects ancient titans to the animals in your backyard. We're talking about the great shrinking of the animal kingdom, a phenomenon so profound that it reshaped every ecosystem on Earth. And here's the thing that might surprise you. This wasn't a gradual change that took millions of years. This happened fast, geologically speaking, and the fingerprints are everywhere once you know where to look. Before we get comfortable, take a moment to like this video if you're curious about the hidden history of our planet. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what the largest wild animal in your area is today. I'm genuinely fascinated by how different the answer to that question would have been just a few thousand years ago. Now, settle in. Dim the lights if you can. Maybe grab something warm to drink, because we're about to journey back to a time when the world was populated by creatures so massive they'd make today's elephants look like house pets. The late Pleistocene epoch, roughly 50,000 years ago, was the golden age of giants. This wasn't some distant dinosaur era buried in deep time. This was practically yesterday in geological terms. Your ancestors, fully modern humans with the same brains and capabilities you have today, walked among creatures that would seem impossible if we didn't have their bones to prove it. Imagine stepping out of your cave in North America and encountering a mastodon browsing nearby, its tusks gleaming in the morning sun. Picture ground sloths the size of small cars, slowly making their way through forests that stretched endlessly in every direction. Envision short-faced bears standing 12 feet tall on their hind legs, dwarfing any grizzly alive today. These weren't isolated oddities. They were the norm. In South America, giant armadillos called glyptodonts trundled across the landscape like living tanks, their shells spanning 10 feet from nose to tail. Massive saber-toothed cats stalked prey through grasslands that supported herds of horse-sized camels and elephant-sized ground sloths. The very air buzzed with the wings of condors whose wingspans exceeded anything flying today. Australia had its own cast of megafauna that would make your jaw drop. Diprotodon, a marsupial the size of a rhinoceros, grazed peacefully alongside giant kangaroos that stood 7 feet tall. Megalania, a monitor lizard stretching 23 feet in length, ruled as an apex predator. Even the birds were giants. Genyornis, a flightless bird weighing over 500 pounds, roamed the continent like a feathered titan. And Europe wasn't left out of this size spectacular. Cave bears that outweighed polar bears shared the landscape with woolly mammoths, Irish elk with antlers spanning 12 feet, and cave lions larger than any big cat alive today. The entire planet was a stage for giants, and humans were just beginning to walk onto that stage. But here's where the story takes a dramatic turn. Within a geological blink of an eye, most of these giants vanished. We're talking about a mass extinction event so severe that it wiped out roughly 80% of all mammal species weighing more than 1,000 kilograms. This wasn't a gradual decline. This was a biological catastrophe that unfolded over mere millennia, sometimes over centuries. The pattern of this extinction reads like a mystery novel, complete with clues that point to a shocking conclusion. When scientists mapped out exactly when and where these giants disappeared, they discovered something remarkable. The extinctions didn't happen all at once across the globe. Instead, they followed a very specific pattern, rolling across continents like a slow-motion wave of disappearance. Africa lost the fewest giants, only about 21% of its megafauna. Eurasia wasn't hit much harder, losing around 35%. But something catastrophic happened when this wave of extinction reached the continents that had been isolated from the African cradle of life. Australia lost 88% of its large mammals. North America lost 72%. South America lost a staggering 83%. What could cause such a geographically specific pattern of extinction? Climate change affects the entire planet, not just certain continents. Asteroid impacts would leave similar signatures worldwide. Disease outbreaks typically don't respect continental boundaries. But there was one factor that spread across the globe in exactly this pattern, reaching different continents at different times. That factor was us. Homo sapiens, modern humans, expanding out of Africa and colonizing every habitable landmass on the planet. And everywhere we went, the giants started disappearing. Now, before you start thinking this is some kind of anti-human narrative, understand that our ancestors weren't cartoon villains twirling their mustaches as they plotted the downfall of megafauna. They were people trying to survive in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. They hunted for food, defended their families, and adapted to new environments just like any other species would. But they were also something new in the world, a highly intelligent, tool-using, cooperative predator, unlike anything that had existed before. The evidence for human involvement in these extinctions comes from multiple lines of research, and it's frankly overwhelming. Radiocarbon dating shows that megafauna extinctions consistently followed human arrival by just a few thousand years, sometimes less. Archaeological sites preserve the bones of extinct giants alongside human tools and butchering marks. Computer models that factor in climate change alone consistently fail to explain the pattern and timing of extinctions, but models that include human factors match the fossil record almost perfectly. A comprehensive study published in Science Advances analyzed extinction patterns over the past 126,000 years and reached a startling conclusion. Approximately 96% of all mammalian extinctions during this period can be attributed to human impacts rather than natural climate fluctuations. But how exactly did relatively small bands of humans manage to drive massive animals to extinction? After all, we're talking about creatures that had survived previous ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and dramatic climate shifts. These weren't fragile hothouse flowers. These were tough, adaptable animals that had weathered millions of years of environmental change. The answer lies in understanding what made humans different from any predator that had come before. Previous predators, no matter how fierce, were constrained by the basic rules of ecology. A lion might kill a zebra, but it can only eat so much before it's satisfied. A pack of wolves might bring down an elk, but they can't hunt continuously without rest. Natural predators exist in balance with their prey because their own survival depends on not overexploiting their food sources. Humans broke those rules. We developed technologies that allowed us to kill far more efficiently than any natural predator. Spears extended our reach. Fire drives allowed small groups to stampede entire herds off cliffs. Coordinated hunting strategies let us target the largest, most valuable animals rather than just the weak and sick. Most importantly, we could preserve meat through drying and smoking, meaning we could kill more than we could immediately consume. But efficiency alone doesn't explain everything. After all, humans had been using tools and hunting cooperatively for hundreds of thousands of years while living alongside African megafauna without driving them extinct. The key difference was that African animals had evolved alongside human ancestors. They had developed instinctive fear responses and defensive behaviors over millions of years of co-evolution. When humans arrived in Australia around 50,000 years ago, they encountered animals that had never seen a human before. These creatures had no evolved fear response to bipedal primates carrying sharp sticks. Imagine a giant wombat, the size of a small car, encountering its first human hunter. It had no genetic programming telling it to run. No instinctive understanding that this small, seemingly harmless creature was actually a deadly threat. It was evolutionarily naive, and that naivety was fatal. The same scenario played out in the Americas when humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge around 15,000 years ago. Massive ground sloths, giant beavers, and enormous bears had never encountered human hunters. They had no more fear of approaching humans than a modern cow has of approaching a farmer. This made them sitting ducks for human hunting parties. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Sites across North and South America preserve the remains of megafauna that show clear signs of human butchering. Cut marks on bones match the patterns you'd expect from stone tools. Projectile points have been found embedded in mammoth ribs. Campsites contain the scattered remains of meals that included species now extinct. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from sites where multiple species were processed simultaneously. At some locations, archaeologists have found the remains of mammoths, giant ground sloths, horses, and camels, all showing butchering marks from the same time period. This suggests coordinated hunting of multiple large species, exactly what you'd expect if human groups were systematically targeting the biggest available game. The speed of these extinctions is particularly telling. In many cases, species that had survived for millions of years disappeared within a few centuries of human arrival. That's far too fast for climate change or habitat loss to be the primary driver. It's exactly the time frame you'd expect for direct human hunting pressure to push vulnerable populations over the edge. But hunting wasn't the only way humans impacted megafauna populations. Our ancestors were also ecosystem engineers, using fire to modify landscapes on a massive scale. Regular burning created more open grasslands and reduced forest cover, fundamentally altering the habitats that many large mammals depended on. Animals adapted to browsing in dense forests suddenly found themselves in increasingly open landscapes with different food sources and hiding places. Human competition for resources also played a role. Large mammals require enormous amounts of food and water. When humans began systematically occupying the most productive habitats, particularly areas near water sources and seasonal migration routes, they squeezed megafauna into increasingly marginal environments where survival became more difficult. The cumulative effect of all these pressures was devastating. Species that had weathered ice ages and volcanic winters couldn't withstand the novel challenge posed by human expansion. One by one, the giants began to disappear, leaving behind only their bones as testimony to a world that once was. This extinction event wasn't just about the loss of individual species. It represented a fundamental restructuring of Earth's ecosystems. When the giants disappeared, they took with them ecological relationships that had persisted for millions of years. Seed dispersal networks collapsed as the largest fruit-eating mammals vanished. Grazing patterns changed dramatically without massive herbivores to maintain grasslands. Predator-prey relationships that had shaped animal behavior for eons suddenly became irrelevant. The ripple effects of losing these ecological giants created cascades of change that we're only beginning to understand. When you remove the largest herbivores from an ecosystem, it's like pulling out the foundation stones from a building. Everything else starts to shift and reorganize around that absence. Consider what happened to carnivores after their primary prey disappeared. Massive predators like the short-faced bear and the American lion suddenly found themselves without the giant ground sloths and horses they had evolved to hunt. These apex predators faced a stark choice: adapt to hunting much smaller prey or face extinction themselves. Most chose extinction. The few large carnivores that survived, like jaguars, underwent dramatic ecological shifts, moving into entirely new hunting niches previously occupied by their extinct competitors. This phenomenon, known as mesocarnivore release, fundamentally altered predator hierarchies across the globe. Without the pressure from larger competitors, medium-sized predators expanded their ranges and changed their hunting behaviors. Jaguars, for instance, went from being mid-level predators to apex predators almost overnight in evolutionary terms. Their diet shifted, their territorial patterns changed, and their entire ecological role transformed. But the changes went far deeper than just predator-prey relationships. Large herbivores are essentially living landscape architects. A single mammoth could knock down trees, create clearings, and trample paths that other animals would use for generations. Giant ground sloths dispersed seeds across vast distances, creating genetic diversity in plant populations that we can still detect in the fossil record. Massive grazers like giant bison maintained grasslands through their feeding patterns, preventing forests from reclaiming open areas. When these megafauna vanished, the very structure of landscapes began to change. Forests crept into areas that had been maintained as grasslands for thousands of years. Fire patterns shifted without large herbivores to create natural fire breaks through their grazing. Wetlands transformed without giant beavers engineering complex water management systems. Rivers changed course without elephants and mastodons creating and maintaining crossing points. The speed of these ecological changes was breathtaking. In some regions, pollen records showed dramatic shifts in plant communities within just a few centuries of megafauna extinction. Forests that had been held in check by browsing giants suddenly expanded. Grasslands that had been maintained by grazing herds became shrubland and then forest. Entire biomes reorganized themselves around the absence of animals that had shaped them for millions of years. These environmental changes created feedback loops that accelerated the extinction process. As habitats transformed, the remaining megafauna found themselves increasingly isolated in shrinking pockets of suitable environment. Species that might have survived the initial hunting pressure found their food sources disappearing and their migration routes blocked by changing vegetation. What began as direct human impact became an unstoppable cascade of ecological collapse. The loss wasn't just about size either. When the giants disappeared, they took with them incredible diversity in body forms, behaviors, and ecological strategies. Giant ground sloths weren't just large versions of modern sloths. They were fundamentally different animals with unique adaptations that had never existed before and would never exist again. Some were specialized diggers that created burrow systems so large that humans still use them as shelters today. Others were browsers that could reach vegetation 20 feet off the ground, occupying a niche that simply vanished when they did. The extinction of these giants also eliminated what scientists call functional diversity. This refers not just to what species existed, but what they actually did in their ecosystems. Modern ecosystems have far fewer functional roles filled by large animals. We have herbivores and carnivores, certainly, but we lack the specialists that once filled incredibly specific niches. There are no more bone crushers like the giant hyenas that could process entire carcasses. No more massive seed dispersers that could carry nutrients across continental distances. No more living bulldozers that could reshape entire landscapes through their daily activities. As ecosystems simplified and lost complexity, they also became less resilient. Complex ecosystems with many interconnected relationships can absorb shocks and disturbances because alternative pathways exist for energy and nutrients to flow. Simple ecosystems are more fragile. When key species are lost, there are fewer alternatives to take their place. The post-extinction world became a place where environmental changes could have much more dramatic and lasting effects. But the story doesn't end with the Pleistocene extinctions. The pattern of size reduction that began with the loss of megafauna has continued right up to the present day. Modern animals are not just smaller than their extinct relatives. They're often smaller than their recent ancestors. This ongoing shrinkage represents one of the most overlooked aspects of human impact on the natural world. Island environments provide some of the clearest examples of how environmental constraints drive animals towards smaller sizes. When large animals become isolated on islands, they face immediate resource limitations. Islands simply can't support the same population sizes as continental environments. Food is limited, space is restricted, and competition becomes intense. Under these pressures, natural selection consistently favors smaller individuals who require fewer resources to survive and reproduce. The fossil record preserves dozens of examples of island dwarfism. Sicily once hosted elephants no larger than ponies. Malta had hippos the size of sheep. Cyprus supported deer that stood barely 3 feet tall. These weren't separate species that happened to be small. They were dwarfed descendants of full-sized mainland animals that had become trapped on islands and evolved smaller body sizes over thousands of generations. The mechanisms driving island dwarfism reveal fundamental principles about how size evolution works. Smaller animals have shorter generation times, meaning they can reproduce faster when conditions are favorable. They require smaller territories, allowing more individuals to coexist in limited space. They need less food to survive periods of scarcity. Most importantly, they can recover more quickly from population bottlenecks that would drive larger species extinct. These same principles apply beyond islands. Anytime animals face resource limitations or increased competition, there's selective pressure towards smaller body sizes. Modern examples are playing out all around us as human activities fragment habitats and create island-like conditions for many species. Forest fragments surrounded by agricultural land function as habitat islands. National parks isolated by development become ecological islands. Even suburban neighborhoods can create island effects for small mammals and birds. Contemporary research has documented size reductions in numerous modern species. Some populations of deer isolated in suburban environments have become significantly smaller than their rural counterparts within just a few decades. Certain bird populations on habitat islands show measurable size decreases compared to continuous forest populations. Fish in heavily harvested waters often evolve smaller adult sizes as large individuals are selectively removed. Climate change adds another layer of pressure towards size reduction. As temperatures increase, many animals are getting smaller in response to thermal stress. This happens because smaller bodies have higher surface area to volume ratios, making them more efficient at dissipating heat. The phenomenon is so consistent that it has its own name, the temperature size rule. Studies across multiple species groups have documented size decreases corresponding to warming temperatures over the past several decades. The metabolic constraints that limit animal size become more important as environmental conditions become more challenging. Large animals have higher absolute energy requirements, making them more vulnerable to food shortages. They also have longer generation times, meaning they adapt more slowly to changing conditions. In a rapidly changing world, being big can be a liability rather than an advantage. But size reduction isn't just about individual survival, it's also about reproductive success. Smaller animals typically reach sexual maturity faster and have shorter intervals between generations. This allows populations to grow more quickly when conditions are favorable and recover more rapidly from setbacks. In unpredictable environments, these reproductive advantages can outweigh any benefits of large size. The fossil record shows that this pattern of size reduction following environmental stress has occurred repeatedly throughout Earth's history. Major extinction events are almost always followed by periods when surviving lineages evolve smaller body sizes. The end Cretaceous extinction that killed the dinosaurs was followed by an era of small mammals. The Permian extinction was followed by the rise of small archosaurs. The pattern is so consistent that paleontologists now recognize it as a fundamental response to environmental upheaval. Modern molecular techniques have allowed scientists to track these size changes with unprecedented precision. DNA analysis can reveal population bottlenecks and genetic changes associated with size reduction. Isotope analysis of museum specimens shows dietary and metabolic changes over time. Even growth ring analysis of bones can reveal how environmental conditions affected individual animals across decades of their lives. The implications of ongoing size reduction extend far beyond academic interest. Smaller animals play different ecological roles than larger ones. They process different amounts of energy, create different impacts on their environments, and support different food web structures. As average animal sizes continue to decrease, we're witnessing a fundamental transformation of how ecosystems function. Human activities continue to drive size-selective pressures in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. Commercial fishing consistently removes the largest individuals, creating evolutionary pressure for fish to mature at smaller sizes. Hunting regulations that protect smaller individuals while allowing harvest of larger ones create similar effects in terrestrial animals. Even urban environments favor smaller animals that can navigate human-dominated landscapes more effectively. The compounding effects of all these pressures suggest that the great shrinking of the animal kingdom is far from over. Current projections indicate that if present trends continue, terrestrial mammal body sizes could become smaller than they have been at any point in the past 45 million years. We're potentially heading toward a world where the largest land animals are smaller than many species that lived alongside our recent ancestors. This transformation represents more than just a statistical curiosity. It reflects a fundamental shift in how life on Earth is organized. The age of giants that characterized our planet for millions of years has given way to an age of smaller, more adaptable, but ultimately more limited creatures. Understanding this transition helps us comprehend not just where we've been, but where we're heading as the dominant force shaping life on our planet. The transformation we've been discussing isn't just ancient history, it's happening right now, in real time, all around us. Modern technology has allowed scientists to document size changes that are occurring within human lifespans, sometimes within single decades. What took thousands of years after the Pleistocene extinctions is now happening at breakneck speed. Take the Atlantic cod populations off the coast of Newfoundland. Fishermen in the 1960s regularly caught cod weighing over 60 pounds. Today, a 30-pound cod is considered a trophy fish. This isn't just about fishing pressure removing the biggest individuals, though that's certainly part of it. Genetic analysis reveals that the cod themselves are evolving to mature at smaller sizes. When large individuals are consistently removed from the population, genes that promote rapid maturation at smaller sizes become advantageous. The fish that survive to reproduce are increasingly those that never grow to the massive sizes their ancestors achieved. Similar patterns are playing out in terrestrial environments. White-tailed deer in suburban areas consistently measure smaller than their rural counterparts. The difference isn't subtle. Urban deer populations show measurably shorter leg bones, smaller skulls, and reduced overall body mass compared to deer living in continuous forest habitats just miles away. The fragmented landscapes of suburban development create resource limitations and competitive pressures that mirror the island environments where dwarfism evolved over geological timescales. Birds provide some of the most dramatic examples of rapid size change. House finches introduced to urban environments in North America have evolved measurably smaller body sizes within just 50 years. Cliff swallows nesting under highway overpasses have developed shorter wings that allow them to make tighter turns, helping them avoid vehicle strikes. These aren't learned behaviors. They're genetic changes that have spread through populations faster than anyone thought possible. Climate change adds another accelerating factor to this size reduction trend. As global temperatures rise, the temperature size rule kicks in with increasing force. Researchers studying everything from beetles to bears have documented consistent decreases in body size corresponding to warming temperatures. The mechanism is straightforward but relentless. Smaller bodies dissipate heat more efficiently, making them better adapted to warmer conditions. The Arctic provides particularly stark examples. Polar bears measured today are significantly smaller than those measured in the 1980s. Caribou herds show declining average weights across their entire range. Even Arctic foxes are getting smaller as their icy habitat transforms into something more temperate. These changes aren't happening over evolutionary timescales. They're occurring within individual lifetimes. But perhaps the most sobering realization is how these modern changes connect to the deeper patterns we've been exploring. The same fundamental forces that drove the Pleistocene extinctions continue to operate today, just at accelerated speeds. Human population growth, technological advancement, and environmental manipulation create pressures that push animal populations towards smaller sizes, as surely as our ancestors' hunting pressure eliminated the megafauna. Consider what happens when we fragment a forest into small patches separated by agricultural land or urban development. Each patch becomes an ecological island with limited carrying capacity. Large animals that require vast territories find themselves squeezed into increasingly small spaces. Those that survive are typically the ones that can make do with smaller territories and fewer resources. Over generations, this selective pressure inevitably favors smaller individuals. The mathematics of this process are unforgiving. Large animals have what ecologists call higher extinction debt. They exist in smaller populations, require more resources per individual, and reproduce more slowly than small animals. When environmental conditions become challenging, large species are always the first to disappear. This isn't a new phenomenon. It's been the rule throughout the history of life on Earth. What makes our current era unique is the speed and global scope of these changes. Previous extinction events, even catastrophic ones like the asteroid impact that ended the age of dinosaurs, were geographically patchy and unfolded over thousands of years. Modern human impact is simultaneously global and immediate. There's nowhere for large animals to retreat, no refuge populations to recolonize empty habitats when conditions improve. The cascading effects of these size reductions ripple through ecosystems in ways we're only beginning to understand. When large herbivores disappear or shrink, plant communities respond within decades. Grasslands that were maintained by the trampling and grazing of large mammals become shrublands and then forests. This vegetation change affects soil chemistry, water retention, and fire patterns across vast landscapes. Seed dispersal networks collapse when large fruit-eating animals vanish or become too small to transport seeds over long distances. Many tropical trees evolved fruits specifically sized for megafauna that no longer exist. These plants now depend on much smaller dispersers that can't carry seeds nearly as far, leading to genetic isolation and reduced diversity in plant populations. Nutrient cycling changes dramatically when large animals disappear from ecosystems. A single elephant can transport enormous quantities of nutrients from nutrient-rich areas to nutrient-poor ones through its daily movements and waste production. When elephants are removed or their populations reduced, this nutrient redistribution stops, leading to patchy landscapes where some areas become nutrient depleted while others accumulate excess nutrients. The loss of ecological complexity that began with the Pleistocene extinctions continues today. Modern ecosystems have fewer species filling fewer functional roles than ecosystems of the past. This simplification makes them more vulnerable to disturbances and less capable of providing the ecosystem services that human societies depend on. Water purification, carbon storage, pollination, pest control, and climate regulation all depend on complex ecological networks. When these networks are simplified through the loss of large species and the general downsizing of animal communities, their ability to provide these services diminishes. We're essentially living off the ecological capital built up over millions of years, while systematically degrading the systems that created that capital. The irony is that as we've become the dominant large animal on the planet, we've created conditions that make being large increasingly difficult for other species. Our infrastructure fragments habitats, our agriculture monopolizes the most productive lands, and our industrial activities alter atmospheric and oceanic chemistry on a global scale. We've become the ultimate ecological filter, selecting for smaller, more adaptable species while eliminating the giants. This filter operates at multiple scales simultaneously. At the global scale, climate change and habitat destruction favor species that can adapt quickly to changing conditions. At the regional scale, landscape fragmentation creates resource limitations that favor smaller animals. At the local scale, direct human activities like hunting, fishing, and urban development consistently remove the largest individuals from populations. The cumulative effect is a world increasingly dominated by what biologists call weedy species. These are typically small, fast-reproducing animals that can thrive in human-modified environments. Rats, pigeons, cockroaches, and crows are classic examples, but the category increasingly includes many species that weren't considered weedy just decades ago. White-tailed deer, once rare in much of their range, have become suburban pests. Canada geese, formerly restricted to remote breeding areas, now populate city parks year-round. Meanwhile, large, slow-reproducing species face an increasingly difficult world. Tigers, rhinos, elephants, and great apes survive mainly in protected areas that function as ecological islands. Even there, their populations are often too small to be genetically viable over the long term. Many exist in what conservation biologists call the living dead state, still present but doomed to eventual extinction unless extraordinary measures are taken. The fossil record suggests this is exactly what we should expect. Every major environmental transition in Earth's history has been associated with the preferential extinction of large species and the rise of smaller ones. The difference is that previous transitions took place over millions of years and were followed by recovery periods when new giants could evolve. Our current transition is happening so rapidly that there's no time for evolutionary recovery. Modern large animals represent evolutionary lineages that took millions of years to develop their impressive sizes. African elephants are the culmination of a 55 million year evolutionary experiment in growing large terrestrial mammals. Blue whales represent the largest animals that ever lived, the product of an equally long evolutionary process. When these species disappear, they take with them genetic and developmental pathways that cannot be quickly replaced. The timescales involved in evolving large body size are staggering. It typically takes hundreds of thousands to millions of years for lineages to evolve significantly larger sizes. This happens through gradual changes in gene regulation, metabolism, and developmental timing that must be carefully coordinated to avoid creating non-viable organisms. Large animals are essentially evolutionary masterpieces, finely tuned biological machines that represent millions of years of natural selection. Evolving smaller body size, by contrast, can happen relatively quickly. Many of the changes required are simply reductions in existing developmental programs rather than the creation of entirely new biological systems. This asymmetry means that while we can lose giants quickly, we cannot replace them quickly. The downsizing of animal communities represents a one-way transition on any timescale relevant to human civilization. Archaeological evidence suggests that our ancestors understood this relationship between size and rarity. Many prehistoric cultures developed taboos around killing the largest individuals in animal populations, recognizing that these were often the most important for maintaining healthy populations. Modern conservation science has confirmed the wisdom of these traditional practices. Large individuals are typically the most reproductively successful, and their removal can have disproportionate impacts on population growth rates. Unfortunately, modern human activities often do exactly the opposite. Commercial fishing targets the largest fish, trophy hunting selects for the biggest animals, and urban development eliminates the large territories that big animals require. We've created a world systematically biased against large size, then wondered why giants are disappearing. The economic implications of this trend extend far beyond conservation concerns. Many ecosystem services are provided disproportionately by large animals. Large herbivores create and maintain grasslands that store carbon and prevent erosion. Large predators control populations of smaller animals that might otherwise become agricultural pests. Large seed dispersers maintain forest diversity that supports timber and pharmaceutical industries. As these large animals disappear or shrink, the economic value of ecosystem services declines. Grasslands without large grazers become less productive and more prone to catastrophic fires. Forests without large seed dispersers become less diverse and more vulnerable to diseases. Agricultural systems without large predators require more pesticides to control crop pests. The replacement of natural ecosystem services with technological alternatives is possible but expensive. Mechanical maintenance of grasslands costs far more than natural grazing. Artificial pollination is more expensive than natural pollination by large animals and birds. Technological pest control requires ongoing inputs of energy and materials that natural predation provides for free. Some forward-thinking conservation efforts are beginning to address these economic realities. Rewilding projects attempt to restore large animals to landscapes where they've been eliminated, recognizing that these species provide valuable ecosystem services. Payment for ecosystem services programs compensate landowners for maintaining habitats that support large animal populations. But these efforts remain small-scale compared to the global forces driving size reduction. Climate change, habitat fragmentation, and direct human pressure continue to accelerate. The rate of environmental change now exceeds the ability of most large species to adapt, creating what biologists call an evolutionary trap. Species that evolved successful strategies over millions of years find those same strategies suddenly maladaptive in human-modified environments. The psychological impact of living in a world of shrinking animals is harder to quantify, but no less real. Humans evolved in landscapes populated by megafauna. Our myths, legends, and cultural symbols reflect deep memories of a world where giants were common. The gradual disappearance of large animals from our daily experience represents a form of cultural impoverishment that's difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Children growing up today will never see wild animals as large as those their grandparents knew. Each generation experiences a slightly more impoverished natural world as normal, leading to what researchers call shifting baseline syndrome. We lose not just the animals themselves, but our collective memory of what a truly wild world looks like. This amnesia makes it difficult to appreciate the magnitude of what we've lost and continue to lose. A forest with no animals larger than a squirrel seems normal to someone who's never known anything else. An ocean with no fish larger than a salmon becomes the new baseline for what healthy marine ecosystems look like. We're inadvertently training ourselves to accept a progressively simplified world as natural. The implications extend beyond nostalgia or aesthetics. Large animals serve as indicators of ecosystem health precisely because they require intact, functioning ecological networks to survive. Their disappearance signals broader environmental degradation that may not be immediately apparent when looking at smaller species or individual ecosystem components. As we continue this journey through the downsizing of Earth's animals, we're witnessing more than just a biological phenomenon. We're observing the transformation of our planet from a world shaped by giants to a world shaped by us. The question that remains is whether we can recognize this transformation quickly enough to preserve some remnant of the magnificent world we inherited, or whether we'll continue down this path until only the smallest and most adaptable creatures remain to share our increasingly simplified planet. The story of shrinking animals is ultimately a story about choices. Every day, through our individual and collective actions, we decide what kind of world we want to live in and what kind of world we'll leave for future generations. The giants of the past are gone forever, but the fate of today's large animals still hangs in the balance. Their story, and ours, is still being written. The cascading effects we've been exploring reveal themselves most clearly when we examine specific ecosystems before and after the great downsizing. Take the grasslands of North America, for instance. 15,000 years ago, these weren't just prairies dotted with bison. They were complex ecosystems maintained by an intricate web of giant herbivores working together like a biological symphony. Picture the scene. Massive ground sloths weighing several tons move through these grasslands like living lawnmowers, their powerful claws stripping bark from trees and preventing woody plants from encroaching on open areas. Giant bison, larger than any modern buffalo, grazed in herds that stretched to the horizon, their hooves aerating soil and their waste fertilizing vast stretches of prairie. Horses, camels, and llamas added their own unique browsing patterns, each species targeting different plants at different heights and times of year. This wasn't chaos, it was orchestrated complexity. Each species played a specific role in maintaining the grassland ecosystem. The largest animals knocked down saplings that might otherwise have turned prairie into forest. Medium-sized grazers maintained the optimal grass height for maximum photosynthesis. Smaller browsers cleaned up fallen branches and controlled understory growth. Together, they created and maintained one of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. When the giants vanished, this intricate system collapsed like a house of cards. Without massive herbivores to control tree growth, forests began creeping into areas that had been grassland for thousands of years. Without the trampling and fertilization provided by huge herds, soil composition changed dramatically. Without the diverse browsing patterns of multiple large species, plant communities simplified and became vulnerable to diseases and extreme weather events. The bison that survived were smaller and less numerous than their extinct relatives. They couldn't maintain the same grazing pressure across such vast areas. Gradually, the great grasslands began to shrink, fragment, and transform into something entirely different. What European settlers encountered when they arrived in North America was already a shadow of the ecosystem that had existed just a few millennia earlier. This pattern played out on every continent where megafauna disappeared. Australian grasslands that had been maintained by giant kangaroos and massive wombats became scrubland and then forest. South American pampas that had supported enormous ground sloths and giant armadillos transformed into different vegetation types entirely. European steppes that had been shaped by woolly mammoths and giant deer became something unrecognizable to their former inhabitants. But the transformation wasn't just about vegetation. When you remove the largest animals from an ecosystem, you fundamentally alter how energy flows through the entire system. Large animals are incredibly efficient at converting plant matter into mobile nutrients. A mammoth could consume hundreds of pounds of vegetation in one area, then transport those nutrients dozens of miles away through its waste. This created nutrient highways that connected distant parts of the landscape and maintained soil fertility across enormous areas. Without these mobile nutrient distributors, landscapes became increasingly patchy. Areas where nutrients naturally accumulated, like river valleys, became incredibly productive. Areas where nutrients were naturally scarce, like hilltops and sandy soils, became increasingly barren. The smooth gradients of productivity that had characterized megafauna-maintained landscapes gave way to stark contrasts between rich and poor areas. The loss of these nutrient highways had profound effects on plant evolution and distribution. Many trees that had evolved to take advantage of megafauna dispersal found themselves stranded. Their seeds, perfectly designed to survive passage through the digestive system of a giant ground sloth or mastodon, now had no way to reach suitable germination sites. Entire plant lineages became evolutionary orphans, dependent on dispersers that no longer existed. Some of these orphan plants still exist today, living fossils that hint at the ecosystem relationships we've lost. Avocados, for instance, evolved fruits perfectly sized for megafauna consumption. The large seed and rich flesh made perfect sense when giant ground sloths roamed Central American forests. Today, avocados depend entirely on human cultivation for their survival. Without us, they would quickly go extinct, their dispersal strategy rendered obsolete by the absence of their evolutionary partners. The honey locust trees that dot the American Midwest tell a similar story. Their massive seed pods, protected by fierce thorns and filled with sweet pulp, were clearly designed for consumption by large animals. No modern North American animal can effectively disperse honey locust seeds. The trees persist as relics, slowly declining in areas where they once thrived under the care of their megafauna partners. These plant orphans represent just the tip of an enormous iceberg of lost ecological relationships. Every extinct megafauna species took with it dozens of unique interactions with plants, smaller animals, and even microorganisms. Parasites that specialized on giant ground sloths vanished with their hosts. Cleaning birds that removed ticks from mammoth hide found themselves without a livelihood. Dung beetles that had evolved to process the waste of massive herbivores suddenly had no appropriate food source. The ripple effects extended into the smallest corners of ecosystems. Soil microbe communities that had adapted to the specific chemistry of megafauna dung had to reorganize around entirely different inputs. Insect communities that had specialized on plants, maintained by large animal browsing, faced sudden habitat loss. Even the acoustic environment changed as the low-frequency calls and massive footsteps of giants fell silent. Modern technology has allowed scientists to quantify some of these lost relationships with startling precision. Chemical analysis of ancient soils reveals nutrient patterns that could only have been created by large animal movements. Pollen records show plant communities that have no modern analogues, combinations of species that made sense only in the presence of specific megafauna interactions. Isotope analysis of fossil bones reveals food web complexity that dwarfs anything we see in modern ecosystems. Perhaps most remarkably, genetic analysis has revealed that many modern plants still carry the molecular signatures of their lost relationships with megafauna. Defensive compounds that evolved to deter browsing by giant herbivores persist in plants that haven't encountered such large browsers for thousands of years. Fruit chemistry that was optimized for digestion by animals that no longer exist continues to be produced by trees that now rely on much smaller and less effective dispersers. These genetic ghosts tell the story of evolution interrupted. Natural selection had spent millions of years fine-tuning the relationships between plants and megafauna. The sudden disappearance of the large partners left plants with elaborate adaptations that no longer served any purpose. It's as if a master craftsman had spent decades perfecting an intricate machine, only to have someone remove half the parts overnight. The consequences of this evolutionary disruption continue to play out today. Plants that evolve defenses against browsing pressure that no longer exists waste energy producing unnecessary compounds. Trees that evolve to depend on long-distance seed dispersal by large animals struggle to colonize new habitats. Flowers that evolved to attract pollinators that have since gone extinct or shrunk in size face reduced reproductive success. This mismatch between evolved adaptations and current ecological reality helps explain why many modern ecosystems seem somehow incomplete or unstable. They're missing crucial components that shaped their evolution for millions of years. It's like trying to run a complex piece of software after deleting essential files. The program might still function, but it operates far below its designed capacity and is prone to unexpected crashes. The instability of post-megafauna ecosystems becomes apparent when we examine their response to environmental stress. Modern grasslands are far more vulnerable to drought than their predecessors because they lack the diverse root systems and soil conditioning that multiple large herbivore species provided. Forests are more prone to catastrophic fires because they lack the natural fire breaks that large animals created through their movements and feeding. This reduced resilience has enormous implications for our ability to predict and manage environmental change. Ecosystems that evolved with megafauna had built-in buffers against disturbance. The diversity of large herbivore feeding strategies meant that if one type of vegetation was damaged by drought or fire, others could fill the gap. The constant movement of large animals meant that local disturbances were quickly recolonized from nearby areas. Without these buffers, modern ecosystems exhibit what ecologists call increased brittleness. They can appear stable for long periods, then suddenly collapse when pushed beyond their reduced tolerance limits. This brittleness makes conservation planning incredibly difficult because the thresholds for ecosystem failure are much lower and less predictable than they would be in intact megafauna communities. Climate change amplifies these vulnerabilities exponentially. Ecosystems that might have weathered temperature and precipitation changes with their full complement of large species find themselves unable to cope with even modest environmental shifts. The migration corridors that large animals once maintained have been broken. The seed dispersal networks that allowed plants to track changing climate zones have been severed. The soil conditioning and nutrient cycling that provided ecosystem stability have been simplified beyond recognition. The Arctic provides a particularly stark example of how the loss of megafauna continues to reshape entire biomes. Woolly mammoths weren't just impressive animals. They were ecosystem engineers whose activities maintained the productivity and stability of northern grasslands. Their constant trampling compacted snow, preventing it from insulating soil and keeping permafrost frozen year-round. Their grazing maintained grass-dominated vegetation that reflected more sunlight than the shrubs and trees that replaced them. When mammoths disappeared, the Arctic ecosystem began a transformation that continues today. Without trampling to compact snow, winter insulation increased and permafrost began to thaw. Without grazing pressure to maintain grasslands, darker vegetation moved in and absorbed more solar radiation. The loss of mammoth ecosystem engineering set in motion feedback loops that are now accelerating Arctic warming and permafrost loss at rates that alarm climate scientists. Some researchers have proposed reintroducing large herbivores to the Arctic to restore these lost ecosystem functions. Projects in Siberia have shown that even modern animals like horses and bison can partially recreate mammoth ecosystem effects when present in sufficient numbers. The grass-dominated landscapes they maintain are more reflective, store more carbon in soil, and keep permafrost more stable than the shrubland that dominates mammoth-free areas. But such projects face enormous challenges. The scale of the original megafauna impact was vast, involving millions of animals across millions of square kilometers. Modern attempts to restore these functions operate at tiny fractions of the original scale. Even if successful, they represent small islands of restored function in a sea of simplified ecosystems. The economic implications of lost ecosystem services continue to mount as we better understand what megafauna provided. Carbon storage in grasslands maintained by large herbivores was significantly higher than in post-megafauna systems. Water retention and flood control provided by diverse large animal impacts cannot be easily replicated by technological means. The pest control services provided by large predators and scavengers are replaced, if at all, by expensive and environmentally damaging chemical interventions. Modern agriculture provides a telling example of how we've tried to replace megafauna ecosystem services with industrial inputs. The nitrogen fertilization that maintains crop productivity attempts to replace the natural fertilization that megafauna provided through their waste. Mechanical tillage substitutes for the soil aeration that large animal hooves provided. Pesticides replace the natural pest control that diverse large animal communities maintained through complex predator-prey relationships. This industrial replacement of natural services works, but at enormous environmental and economic cost. The energy required to produce synthetic fertilizers is staggering. The environmental damage from pesticide use continues to accumulate. The soil degradation caused by mechanical tillage reduces long-term agricultural sustainability. In essence, we're using fossil fuels and industrial chemistry to poorly replicate services that megafauna provided for free for millions of years. The comparison becomes even more stark when we consider the sustainability of these different approaches. Megafauna-maintained ecosystems operated for millions of years without external inputs, continuously recycling nutrients and maintaining soil health through biological processes powered by solar energy. Industrial agriculture requires constant inputs of energy and materials, depletes soil faster than it can be naturally replenished, and produces waste streams that often become environmental problems themselves. Urban environments provide another lens for understanding the ongoing effects of animal downsizing. Cities represent extreme examples of the fragmented, resource-limited habitats that favor small body sizes. The animals that thrive in urban environments are almost exclusively small, fast-reproducing species that can exploit the novel niches that human activities create. But cities also reveal what we've lost in terms of human-animal relationships. Archaeological evidence shows that early human settlements were regularly visited by large animals seeking water, salt, or other resources. These interactions shaped human cultures and mythologies in profound ways. The gradual disappearance of large animals from human environments has impoverished our collective imagination and reduced our sense of connection to the natural world. The psychological effects of this impoverishment are difficult to measure, but increasingly recognized by researchers studying human well-being. Children who grow up without exposure to large wild animals show different patterns of environmental concern and nature connection than those who do encounter such animals. The sense of wonder and respect that large animals inspire seems to be crucial for developing deep environmental awareness. Modern zoos and wildlife parks attempt to provide these experiences, but seeing animals in captivity provides only a pale reflection of encountering them in wild settings. The behavioral patterns, social structures, and ecological relationships that make large animals truly impressive are largely absent in captive environments. We're left with living museums that preserve the physical forms of large animals while eliminating most of what made them ecologically significant. The contrast becomes apparent when we examine historical accounts of human megafauna encounters. Early explorers and naturalists wrote with genuine awe about animals whose size and behavior exceeded anything in their previous experience. Modern nature documentaries attempt to recreate this sense of wonder, but they're documenting a world that's already been dramatically simplified compared to what our ancestors knew. This cultural impoverishment has practical consequences for conservation efforts. It's difficult to generate public support for protecting animals that most people have never encountered and can barely imagine. The abstract knowledge that elephants or rhinos exist somewhere in distant protected areas lacks the emotional impact of regular encounters with large animals in local environments. The few remaining areas where large animals persist in something approaching natural densities provide glimpses of what we've lost globally. East African savannas, with their herds of elephants, giraffes, and buffalo, offer a window into the past when such concentrations of megafauna were common on every continent. But even these refugia are simplified compared to their prehistoric counterparts, lacking the diversity of large species that once characterized intact megafauna communities. Marine environments tell a similar story of lost giants and simplified ecosystems. The oceans once supported populations of great whales that dwarfed modern numbers. Blue whales, the largest animals ever known to exist, were far more numerous before industrial whaling reduced their populations by over 90%. Their absence has fundamentally altered ocean nutrient cycling and productivity patterns. Whales function as biological pumps, transporting nutrients from deep ocean feeding areas to surface waters, where they support primary productivity. The massive populations of great whales that once existed moved enormous quantities of nutrients from the deep sea to shallow coastal waters, supporting fish populations and marine ecosystems that modern oceans can no longer sustain. The recovery of some whale populations following the end of industrial whaling has provided dramatic demonstrations of how large animals can restore ecosystem functions. Areas where whale populations have recovered show increased marine productivity, enhanced fish populations, and improved overall ecosystem health. But even the most successful whale conservation stories involve populations that remain far below their historical levels. Shark populations provide an even more sobering example of marine downsizing. Many shark species have declined by over 90% from historical levels, with the largest species suffering the greatest losses. Tiger sharks, great whites, and whale sharks that once patrolled every ocean in substantial numbers now persist in small, fragmented populations that struggle to maintain their ecological roles. The loss of large sharks has triggered cascading effects throughout marine food webs. Smaller shark species and other predators have expanded into niches once occupied by giants, but they can't fully replace the ecosystem functions that large sharks provided. The result is simplified marine communities with reduced resilience to environmental stress and diminished capacity to support fisheries and other human uses. Freshwater environments show perhaps the most dramatic examples of lost giants. Rivers and lakes once supported massive fish that rivaled marine species in size. Sturgeon weighing over 1,000 pounds migrated up major river systems. Catfish the size of small whales inhabited large rivers. Salmon runs included individuals that dwarfed modern fish. The construction of dams, overfishing, and habitat modification eliminated most of these freshwater giants within just a few human generations. The Columbia River, which once supported salmon runs so massive that the sound of fish jumping could be heard for miles, now maintains artificially sustained populations of much smaller fish through extensive hatchery programs. The ecological roles of these freshwater giants extended far beyond their aquatic habitats. Massive salmon runs transported marine nutrients hundreds of miles inland, fertilizing riparian forests and supporting terrestrial ecosystems throughout entire watersheds. Bears, eagles, and other large animals timed their life cycles around these predictable pulses of abundant food. When the giant fish disappeared, entire food webs collapsed and had to reorganize around much smaller and less reliable food sources. Modern fish ladders and other technological interventions attempt to restore some connectivity to fragmented river systems, but they're designed for the smaller fish that remain, rather than the giants that once dominated these systems. The infrastructure that might support massive sturgeon or giant salmon migrations simply doesn't exist in most developed watersheds. The pattern of downsizing that began with the Pleistocene extinctions has thus continued and accelerated through every environment on Earth. From terrestrial megafauna to marine giants to freshwater leviathans, the trend towards smaller body sizes represents one of the most consistent and far-reaching changes in the history of life on our planet. Understanding this transformation helps us appreciate not just what we've lost, but what we continue to lose as the great downsizing of Earth's animals continues into an uncertain future. The speed at which these changes occurred challenges everything we thought we knew about evolutionary timescales. Traditional paleontology taught us that major biological transformations required millions of years to unfold. Species gradually adapted to changing conditions through countless generations of small modifications. Body size evolution was supposed to follow this same leisurely pace, with lineages slowly trending larger or smaller over geological epochs. But the fossil record tells a different story entirely. When we examine the bones with precise dating techniques, we discover that many size changes happened within timeframes that seem almost impossible. Some populations of island elephants went from full-size to pony-sized in less than 10,000 years. Certain deer species lost over half their body mass in similar timeframes. These aren't gradual evolutionary trends. They're biological emergencies playing out at breakneck speed. The mechanisms driving such rapid change involve more than simple natural selection. When populations become isolated and face severe resource constraints, they experience what biologists call evolutionary rescue. The genetic variants that allow survival under new conditions spread through populations much faster than normal because the alternative is extinction. Size reduction becomes an evolutionary lifeline, allowing species to persist in environments that would otherwise eliminate them entirely. Modern genetic techniques have revealed the molecular basis of these rapid transformations. Many of the genes that control body size are master regulators that affect multiple developmental pathways simultaneously. Small changes in these regulatory genes can produce dramatic shifts in adult body size within just a few generations. It's like adjusting a master volume control, rather than fine-tuning individual instruments in an orchestra. This genetic architecture explains how evolution can produce such dramatic size changes so quickly when the pressure is intense enough. The same mechanisms that allowed rapid dwarfing in island populations continue to operate today in fragmented habitats around the world. Urban environments, agricultural landscapes, and climate-altered ecosystems all create the kind of intense, selective pressure that can drive rapid evolutionary change. But rapid evolution comes with hidden costs that only become apparent over longer timescales. When populations evolve smaller sizes quickly, they often lose genetic diversity in the process. The individuals that survive the evolutionary bottleneck carry only a subset of the genetic variation that existed in the original population. This reduced diversity makes future adaptation more difficult and increases vulnerability to diseases and environmental changes. Island populations provide clear examples of these long-term costs. While dwarfed elephants successfully adapted to island life, they also became more vulnerable to environmental disturbances. When sea levels rose or climates changed, these specialized populations had fewer genetic tools available for adaptation. Many island dwarf species that survived for thousands of years ultimately went extinct when faced with novel challenges they couldn't evolve to meet. The same vulnerability affects modern populations undergoing rapid size evolution. Urban animals that adapt quickly to city life often show reduced genetic diversity compared to their rural counterparts. Fish populations that evolve smaller sizes in response to heavy fishing lose the genetic basis for large body size and may be unable to recover even when fishing pressure is reduced. The evolutionary solutions that ensure short-term survival can create long-term evolutionary dead ends. This paradox highlights one of the most troubling aspects of the current biodiversity crisis. We're not just losing species, we're forcing the survivors to evolve in ways that reduce their long-term viability. The animals that remain in our simplified world are often evolutionary shadows of their ancestors, carrying reduced genetic potential and diminished adaptive capacity. Climate change adds another layer of complexity to these evolutionary dynamics. As temperatures rise and precipitation patterns shift, many animals face a double burden. They must simultaneously adapt to climate change and to the habitat fragmentation that human activities create. The combination of these pressures creates evolutionary scenarios unlike anything in the fossil record. Consider the plight of mountain-dwelling animals as climate zones shift upward. Species that have spent millions of years adapting to specific elevation ranges suddenly find their preferred habitats moving beyond the peaks of the mountains they inhabit. They can't migrate upward indefinitely, and the lower elevations are often dominated by human activities that exclude large animals. The result is an evolutionary squeeze that favors rapid adaptation to warmer conditions, often through size reduction. High elevation mammals are particularly vulnerable to this climate-driven downsizing. Smaller bodies lose heat more efficiently, making them better adapted to warmer conditions. But mountain ecosystems have historically been refugia for large animals precisely because their cold conditions favored larger body sizes. As these refugia warm, they lose their capacity to support the large animals that have depended on them for millions of years. The Arctic represents the most dramatic example of climate-driven ecosystem transformation. The region is warming twice as fast as the global average, fundamentally altering the physical and biological systems that have persisted since the last ice age. Arctic animals face some of the most intense evolutionary pressure anywhere on Earth as their frozen world transforms into something unrecognizable. Polar bears provide the most visible example of this transformation. These massive predators evolved to hunt seals on sea ice, developing the largest body sizes of any bear species to help them survive in their harsh environment. But as sea ice disappears, polar bears are forced to spend more time on land, where their large size becomes a liability rather than an advantage. Smaller bears need less food to survive periods when hunting opportunities are limited. The evolutionary response is already visible in some polar bear populations. Bears in areas where sea ice has declined most dramatically show measurably smaller average sizes than populations in areas where ice persists longer. This isn't just individual bears losing weight due to poor hunting conditions. It's genetic change spreading through populations as smaller bears prove more successful at surviving in the new environment. Similar patterns are emerging across the Arctic. Caribou herds that migrate across increasingly unreliable ice surfaces favor smaller individuals that are less likely to break through thin ice. Arctic foxes, in areas where traditional prey species have become scarce, show evolutionary shifts towards smaller sizes that allow them to survive on alternative food sources. Even Arctic birds are evolving smaller sizes as their food webs simplify and become less productive. The speed of these changes has caught scientists off guard. Climate models predicted that Arctic ecosystems would face severe stress, but few anticipated that evolutionary responses would be detectable within decades rather than centuries. The reality is that when environmental change is rapid and severe, evolution can keep pace in ways that seemed impossible just a generation ago. But keeping pace doesn't mean maintaining ecosystem function. The Arctic that emerges from this period of rapid change will be fundamentally different from what existed before. Smaller animals create different impacts on their environments, process energy differently, and support different food web structures. The new Arctic may be biologically functional, but it will be ecologically impoverished compared to what we're losing. Tropical environments face equally dramatic but different challenges. Rainforests are experiencing unprecedented rates of habitat fragmentation as human populations expand, and development pressures intensify. The result is a landscape increasingly dominated by small forest patches, separated by agricultural land and urban development. These fragments function as ecological islands, creating the same evolutionary pressures toward size reduction that occurred on actual islands throughout geological history. The response has been swift and measurable. Primate populations in small forest fragments show clear trends towards smaller body sizes within just a few decades. Large fruit-eating birds that require extensive territories are replaced by smaller species that can survive in restricted areas. Even invertebrates show size reductions as forest patches become too small to support the complex ecological relationships that large insects require. But tropical fragmentation creates additional complications that island environments don't face. The matrix of agricultural and urban land between forest patches is often hostile to native species, preventing movement and gene flow between populations. This isolation accelerates genetic bottlenecks and reduces the evolutionary options available to species trying to adapt to fragment conditions. The edge effects that penetrate into forest fragments also create novel selective pressures. The altered light, temperature, and moisture conditions near fragment edges favor different species and different body sizes than forest interiors. Animals that can tolerate these edge conditions often have smaller sizes that help them regulate temperature and water balance in the altered microclimate. Marine environments are experiencing their own version of fragmentation through ocean acidification, warming, and pollution. Coral reefs, often called the rainforests of the sea, are becoming increasingly patchy as bleaching events eliminate large areas of living coral. The fish communities that depend on these reefs are responding with rapid evolutionary changes, including shifts towards smaller body sizes. The mechanisms driving marine downsizing often involve changes in food web structure. As large predatory fish are removed by overfishing, the communities that remain reorganize around smaller species. These smaller fish face less predation pressure from large predators, but they also have access to different food sources and live in simplified ecosystems with reduced carrying capacity. Ocean chemistry changes add another layer of evolutionary pressure. As seawater becomes more acidic due to increased atmospheric carbon dioxide, shell-building organisms face higher metabolic costs for maintaining their protective structures. Smaller shells require less energy to build and maintain, creating selection pressure for reduced size in everything from microscopic plankton to large mollusks. The cumulative effect of these multiple pressures is an ocean that's becoming dominated by smaller organisms at every level of the food web. Phytoplankton communities are shifting towards smaller species that can better tolerate acidic conditions. Zooplankton that feed on phytoplankton are also getting smaller, following their food source. Fish that depend on zooplankton follow suit, creating cascading size reductions throughout marine ecosystems. These marine changes have profound implications for ocean productivity and carbon cycling. Smaller organisms process energy and nutrients differently than larger ones. They reproduce faster, but live shorter lives. They create different patterns of carbon storage and release. The net effect is oceans that may remain biologically active, but function very differently from the marine ecosystems that have existed for millions of years. Agricultural landscapes provide perhaps the clearest examples of how human activities create evolutionary pressure for size reduction. Modern farming creates vast areas of simplified habitat where only the most adaptable species can survive. These agricultural environments strongly favor small, fast-reproducing animals that can exploit the resources that farming provides, while avoiding the control measures that farmers employ. The evolutionary response has been rapid and dramatic. Rodent populations in agricultural areas consistently evolve smaller sizes than their counterparts in natural habitats. Smaller rodents can hide more effectively from predators and control measures. They can survive on smaller food caches, making them less vulnerable to crop management practices. They can reproduce more quickly, allowing their populations to recover rapidly from periodic control efforts. Birds that have adapted to agricultural environments show similar patterns. Many farmland species have evolved smaller sizes that allow them to exploit crop resources more efficiently while avoiding detection. Smaller birds can feed on smaller seeds and insects, making them less dependent on the large prey items that modern agriculture often eliminates through pesticide use. The insects that thrive in agricultural environments are almost exclusively small species that can complete their life cycles quickly and hide effectively from control measures. Large, slow-developing insects simply cannot survive in environments where their habitats are regularly disturbed and their food sources are treated with pesticides. The result is insect communities that are dominated by small, weedy species, rather than the diverse size classes that characterize pre-agricultural landscapes. These agricultural evolutionary pressures extend beyond the farms themselves. Animals in natural areas adjacent to agricultural land often face similar selection pressures as farming practices affect water quality, air quality, and habitat connectivity across large landscapes. The evolutionary effects of agriculture thus reach far beyond the fields themselves, influencing animal evolution across entire regions. Urban environments create even more intense pressure for size reduction. Cities represent the most extreme form of habitat modification that humans create, with almost every aspect of the natural environment altered to serve human needs. The animals that succeed in urban environments must navigate a world of concrete, glass, and steel while avoiding vehicles, pollution, and active human management. The evolutionary response has been swift and consistent across different urban environments worldwide. urban bird populations show clear trends towards smaller body sizes compared to rural populations of the same species. Smaller birds are more maneuverable in the complex three-dimensional environment that cities create. They can exploit the smaller food sources that urban environments provide, from food scraps to insects attracted to artificial lights. Urban mammals follow similar patterns. Raccoons, squirrels, and other urban-adapted mammals consistently measure smaller in city environments than in natural habitats. The fragmented nature of urban habitats favors animals that can survive in small territories. The abundant but unpredictable food sources that cities provide favor animals that can subsist on smaller meals and more varied diets. Even urban insects show rapid evolutionary responses to city life. Many urban insect populations have evolved smaller sizes within just a few decades of city development. The heat island effects that make cities warmer than surrounding areas favor smaller insects that can dissipate heat more effectively. The artificial lighting that characterizes urban environments creates novel selection pressures that often favor smaller species. The speed of urban evolution has surprised researchers studying city wildlife. What were thought to be fixed species, characteristics can change measurably within human lifespans as animal populations adapt to urban conditions. These changes aren't just individual responses to urban environments, they're genetic changes that are passed on to subsequent generations. But urban evolution comes with trade-offs that limit the long-term success of city-adapted animals. Urban environments are typically poor in the resources that large animals need to maintain complex social structures and sophisticated behaviors. Urban animals often show reduced cognitive abilities, simplified social behaviors, and increased stress responses compared to their rural relatives. The noise and light pollution that characterize urban environments create additional evolutionary pressures that indirectly favor smaller sizes. Smaller animals typically have higher frequency vocalizations that can cut through urban noise more effectively. They're also less disrupted by artificial lighting because their smaller eyes are less sensitive to light pollution. These sensory advantages give smaller urban animals significant survival benefits. The chemical pollution that concentrates in urban environments also creates selection pressure for smaller body sizes. Toxins bioaccumulate in animal tissues, with larger animals typically accumulating higher concentrations due to their position in food webs and their longer lifespans. Smaller animals with faster metabolisms can process and eliminate toxins more quickly, giving them survival advantages in polluted environments. Road mortality represents another urban pressure that consistently favors smaller animals. Large animals are more likely to be struck by vehicles simply because they present bigger targets and move more slowly across roads. Smaller animals can dart across roads more quickly and are more likely to pass under vehicles without being hit. Over time, this creates strong selection pressure against large size in areas with heavy traffic. The fragmentation of urban habitats also prevents the large territories that big animals require. Urban parks and green spaces, no matter how well designed, typically cannot support the space requirements of large mammals or birds. The animals that thrive in cities are those that can complete their entire life cycles within small, isolated habitat patches. These urban evolutionary pressures are particularly important because urban environments are expanding rapidly worldwide. More than half of the human population now lives in cities, and this proportion is expected to reach 70% by 2050. As urban areas expand, they create evolutionary pressure for size reduction across increasingly large portions of the Earth's surface. The combined effects of all these different selective pressures, from climate change to habitat fragmentation to urbanization, are creating what some biologists call a perfect storm for animal downsizing. Never before in Earth's history have so many different factors simultaneously favored smaller body sizes across so many different environments. The result is evolutionary pressure for size reduction that's both global in scope and unprecedented in intensity. This pressure is particularly intense because many of the factors driving downsizing operate simultaneously rather than sequentially. An animal population might face climate change, habitat fragmentation, pollution, and direct human pressure all at the same time. The cumulative effect of these multiple stressors creates evolutionary scenarios that are far more challenging than anything preserved in the fossil record. The fossil record shows that previous mass extinction events were followed by evolutionary radiations that eventually restored ecosystem complexity and large body sizes. But these recovery periods typically required millions of years and occurred in environments that were largely free of human influence. Modern animals face the challenge of adapting to human-dominated environments while also dealing with rapid climate change and habitat destruction. The question that haunts conservation biologists is whether modern ecosystems can maintain their basic functions with the simplified animal communities that are emerging from this evolutionary downsizing. Smaller animals provide different ecosystem services than larger ones. They process energy and nutrients at different rates. They create different impacts on vegetation and soil. They support different parasites and diseases. The early evidence suggests that while simplified ecosystems can remain functional, they operate at reduced capacity and with less stability than more complex systems. Grasslands maintained by small herbivores store less carbon than those maintained by large ones. Forests dispersed by small animals show less genetic diversity than those dispersed by large animals. Marine ecosystems dominated by small fish are more vulnerable to environmental fluctuations than those with diverse size classes. These functional changes have direct implications for human welfare. Many of the ecosystem services that human societies depend on are provided more effectively by large animals than small ones. Carbon storage, water purification, soil formation, and pest control all depend on ecological processes that are enhanced by animal size diversity. As animal communities become dominated by smaller species, their capacity to provide these services diminishes. The economic costs of this functional simplification are only beginning to be calculated. Replacing natural pest control with chemical pesticides costs billions of dollars annually. Replacing natural pollination with artificial methods is even more expensive. Replacing natural carbon storage with technological solutions is prohibitively costly. Yet these are the kinds of substitutions that become necessary as the animals that provide these services naturally become smaller and less capable. Some conservation efforts are beginning to recognize the importance of maintaining large animals, not just for their intrinsic value, but for the ecosystem services they provide. Rewilding projects that reintroduce large herbivores to degraded landscapes often show rapid improvements in ecosystem function. Protected areas that maintain viable populations of large animals consistently outperform those dominated by smaller species in terms of ecosystem service provision. But these conservation successes remain small islands in a sea of ongoing downsizing. The global forces driving animal size reduction continue to intensify. Climate change is accelerating. Habitat fragmentation is expanding. Urban development is consuming natural areas at unprecedented rates. The evolutionary pressure for smaller sizes shows no signs of abating. Understanding this process helps us recognize what we're witnessing as more than just individual species conservation challenges. We're observing a fundamental transformation of how life on Earth is organized. The age of giants that characterized our planet for most of its history is giving way to an age of adaptation, where success is measured not by size or power, but by the ability to survive in an increasingly human-dominated world. This transformation raises profound questions about what kind of planet we want to live on, and what kind of natural heritage we want to leave for future generations. The animals that remain are increasingly those that can tolerate or even thrive alongside human activities. They're often intelligent, adaptable, and resilient, but they're also smaller, simpler, and less ecologically impactful than their predecessors. The choice we face isn't whether this downsizing will continue, The evolutionary pressures are too strong and too widespread to reverse completely. The choice is whether we'll take conscious action to preserve refugia where larger animals can persist, or whether we'll simply accept a world where biological grandeur becomes increasingly rare. The giants of the past are gone forever, but the fate of today's large animals still hangs in the balance, shaped by decisions we make every day about how we want to share our planet with the other species that call it home. Home. The story becomes even more complex when we examine how the downsizing process feeds back on itself, creating what ecologists call accelerating loops of simplification. As animal communities lose their largest members, the remaining species face altered competitive landscapes that push them toward even smaller sizes. It's a biological domino effect where each falling giant makes survival harder for the next tier of large animals. Consider what happened to North American carnivores after the great bears and saber-toothed cats vanished. Wolves, which had been mid-level predators in ecosystems dominated by massive carnivores, suddenly found themselves as apex predators, but they inherited a world with far fewer large prey animals to sustain them. The giant ground sloths, massive bison, and huge horses that had supported diverse carnivore communities were gone. What remained were smaller herbivores that couldn't support the same density of large predators. The result was predictable. Wolf populations crashed across much of their range, not because they were directly hunted to extinction, but because the ecosystem couldn't support large predator populations without large prey. The survivors were those that could subsist on smaller prey animals, fish, and even plant matter when necessary. Over time, this created selection pressure for smaller, more generalist wolves that could survive in the simplified ecosystems left behind by the megafauna extinctions. This cascade effect rippled through every level of the food web. Scavenging birds that had depended on massive carcasses left by giant predators suddenly faced a world where dead animals were smaller and more quickly consumed by the remaining carnivores. Species like the giant teratorn, with wingspans exceeding those of modern condors, found themselves without the reliable food sources they had evolved to exploit. These magnificent soaring birds, perfectly adapted for finding and feeding on megafauna carcasses across vast landscapes, had no ecological niche in a world of smaller animals. The mathematical reality of these changes is stark. Large animals support exponentially more secondary consumers than small animals. A single mammoth carcass could feed dozens of predators and scavengers for weeks. The equivalent biomass in smaller animals is consumed much more quickly and supports far fewer secondary species. When you lose the giants, you don't just lose those specific species, you lose the entire ecological pyramid they supported. Marine environments demonstrate this principle with crystal clarity. When great whale populations were decimated by industrial whaling, the effects cascaded through entire ocean ecosystems. Whale carcasses that sink to the deep ocean floor create unique ecosystems that can persist for decades, supporting hundreds of specialized species found nowhere else on Earth. These whale falls were once common features of the ocean floor, creating stepping stones of specialized habitat across ocean basins. The loss of most great whales eliminated these deep-sea oases from vast areas of the ocean. Species that had evolved specifically to colonize whale carcasses found themselves with nowhere to go. Deep-sea ecosystems that had been connected by whale fall corridors became isolated. The result was a simplification of deep ocean biodiversity that we're only now beginning to understand. But the cascading effects extended beyond the deep sea. Great whales are mobile nutrient pumps, feeding at depth and releasing nutrients at the surface through their waste. The nutrients that whale excrement provide support, phytoplankton blooms that form the base of marine food webs. Fewer whales means less nutrient transport, which means less primary productivity, which means less food for everything else in the ocean. Recent research has revealed the staggering scale of this lost productivity. Historical whale populations may have transported nutrients to surface waters at levels comparable to all the world's rivers combined. The elimination of most great whales reduced this nutrient flow by over 90% in many ocean regions. We're talking about a collapse in marine productivity that rivals the effects of major climate changes in the geological past. The recovery of some whale populations has provided dramatic proof of these nutrient cycling effects. Areas where humpback whales have returned to historical feeding grounds show measurable increases in phytoplankton productivity. Fish populations in these areas often increase substantially within just a few years of whale recovery. The whales aren't just returning to these ecosystems, they're actively restoring them through their biological functions. But even the most successful whale recovery stories involve populations that remain far below historical levels. Blue whale populations, despite decades of protection, remain at perhaps 5% of their pre-whaling numbers. Right whales, despite intensive conservation efforts, continue to decline toward extinction. The nutrient transport and ecosystem engineering that these species provided at historical population levels cannot be restored without population recovery on a scale that seems increasingly unlikely. This highlights one of the most sobering aspects of the downsizing phenomenon. Many of the ecological functions that large animals provided can only be restored through population recovery, not just species preservation. A few dozen elephants in a protected area cannot maintain the landscape-scale ecosystem engineering that millions of elephants once provided. A handful of surviving sturgeon cannot transport nutrients up river systems the way massive historical runs once did. The threshold effects that govern these ecosystem functions create what conservation biologists call extinction debt. Species and ecosystems can appear stable for extended periods while carrying hidden vulnerabilities that eventually lead to collapse. A forest fragment might support a breeding population of large animals for decades before the accumulated effects of isolation and reduced genetic diversity trigger local extinction. An ocean region might maintain apparently healthy fish communities for years before the loss of whale-mediated nutrient cycling causes productivity to crash. These delayed effects make the current biodiversity crisis particularly insidious. Many of the ecosystems that appear healthy today are actually living on borrowed time, sustained by ecological momentum from past conditions that no longer exist. As this momentum dissipates, we're likely to see accelerating ecosystem collapses that seem to come out of nowhere but actually represent the delayed consequences of changes that occurred decades or centuries ago. Island systems provide the clearest examples of how these extinction debts eventually come due. When large animals first disappear from islands, the immediate effects are often subtle. Plants that depended on large animals for seed dispersal may continue to reproduce using their existing seed banks. Trees that relied on large herbivores to maintain clearings may persist for decades on the momentum of past disturbance patterns. But eventually, the lack of seed dispersal catches up with plant populations. Forests that aren't maintained by large herbivore disturbance begin to change composition. Soil chemistry shifts as the nutrient cycling provided by large animals ceases. What appeared to be a stable post-extinction ecosystem gradually reveals itself to be a transitional state, heading towards something much more simplified. Madagascar provides a heartbreaking example of this delayed collapse. When humans first arrived on the island around 2,000 years ago, they encountered an ecosystem dominated by giant lemurs, massive tortoises, elephant birds, and other megafauna. These animals disappeared relatively quickly after human arrival, but many of the plant communities they had maintained persisted for centuries afterward. Only now, 2 millennia later, are the full consequences of those extinctions becoming apparent. Forests that were maintained by giant lemur feeding and movement patterns are collapsing as trees age and cannot be replaced due to lack of seed dispersal. Grasslands that were created by massive tortoise grazing are being invaded by forests and becoming unrecognizable. The Madagascar we see today is not the stable result of past extinctions, but a transitional ecosystem still in the process of simplifying towards some unknown end state. This delayed simplification process is accelerating as human pressures intensify. Climate change, habitat fragmentation, and invasive species are triggering the collapse of ecosystem functions that had persisted for centuries after the initial loss of large animals. What took millennia to develop is unraveling in decades as multiple stressors overwhelm systems that were already operating below their historical capacity. Modern conservation efforts often focus on preserving what exists today without fully recognizing how much has already been lost to these delayed effects. Protected areas that seem to preserve intact ecosystems may actually be protecting transitional states that will continue to simplify without active intervention. Species that appear stable may be carrying genetic and demographic debts that will eventually trigger population crashes. Understanding these dynamics has led some conservation biologists to advocate for what they call proactive restoration rather than passive protection. This approach recognizes that many ecosystems cannot be preserved in their current state because their current state is unsustainable without the ecological functions that large animals once provided. Instead of trying to freeze ecosystems in their present condition, proactive restoration attempts to rebuild the ecological relationships that made those systems stable in the first place. Rewilding represents the most ambitious form of proactive restoration. Rather than just protecting existing small animals, rewilding projects attempt to restore large herbivores and predators to landscapes where they've been eliminated. The goal is not just species conservation, but ecosystem restoration through the recovery of ecological functions that only large animals can provide. European rewilding projects have produced some remarkable successes. The reintroduction of large herbivores to abandoned agricultural lands has restored grassland ecosystems that support much higher biodiversity than the simplified agricultural or forest systems they replaced. Wolves returning to areas where they'd been eliminated have restored natural predation patterns that control deer populations and allow forest regeneration. But even the most successful rewilding projects operate at scales far below what would be needed to restore historical ecosystem functions. The Pleistocene Park project in Siberia, which attempts to restore mammoth steppe ecosystems using modern large herbivores, covers just a few square kilometers compared to the millions of square kilometers that mammoth steppes once occupied. The project has demonstrated that large herbivores can restore grassland ecosystems and even affect permafrost stability, but the scale is tiny compared to the original system. African conservation areas provide perhaps the best remaining examples of what large animal ecosystems can achieve, but even these are shadows of their historical counterparts. The Serengeti ecosystem, often cited as the world's greatest remaining wildlife spectacle, supports perhaps 10% of the large animal biomass that characterized similar ecosystems before human impact. The famous wildebeest migration involves around 1 million animals today, but paleontological evidence suggests that similar migrations once involved many times that number across much larger areas. Even in these refugia, the downsizing trend continues. Elephants in many African populations are evolving smaller body sizes and shorter tusks in response to poaching pressure. Lions show measurably smaller average sizes in areas where their prey base has been depleted by human activities. The largest remaining intact ecosystems are still subject to the same evolutionary pressures that are driving size reduction globally. The speed of these changes in supposedly protected areas reveals how pervasive the forces driving downsizing have become. National parks and reserves that seem to offer secure refugia for large animals are increasingly proving inadequate as human pressures intensify around their borders. Climate change affects even the most remote protected areas. Pollution travels across international boundaries. The evolutionary pressures that favor smaller sizes penetrate even the most carefully guarded wilderness areas. This realization has led to new approaches to conservation that recognize the need to manage evolutionary processes rather than just species populations. Genetic rescue programs attempt to maintain the genetic diversity that large body size requires. Corridor projects try to connect fragmented populations to prevent the isolation that drives rapid size evolution. Buffer zones around protected areas attempt to reduce the edge effects that create evolutionary pressure for smaller sizes. But these efforts face enormous challenges in a world where human influence extends everywhere. Atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations affect every ecosystem on Earth. Microplastics have been found in the most remote locations. Light and noise pollution from human activities now reach areas that were pristine just decades ago. The idea of preserving truly natural evolutionary processes may no longer be possible anywhere on the planet. This global reach of human influence means that all animals now evolve in human-modified environments to some degree. Even species that never directly encounter humans live in atmospheres altered by human activities, eat food contaminated with human-produced chemicals, and navigate magnetic fields disrupted by human technology. The baseline for what constitutes a natural environment continues to shift as human influence becomes more pervasive. The implications extend beyond individual species or even ecosystems. We're witnessing the emergence of what some scientists call the homogenocene, an era characterized by the global homogenization of life as human influence eliminates regional differences and favors the same types of organisms everywhere. Small, adaptable, fast-reproducing species thrive in human-modified environments worldwide, while large, specialized, slow-reproducing species struggle everywhere. This homogenization represents a fundamental loss of biological diversity at the largest scales. Millions of years of evolution had produced unique assemblages of species on different continents and in different environments. Australia had marsupials, South America had unique placental mammals, islands had endemic species found nowhere else. Human influence is erasing these differences as the same types of organisms succeed everywhere, while regionally unique species disappear. The economic implications of this biological homogenization are staggering. Much of human wealth depends on biological diversity, from agricultural crops to pharmaceutical compounds to ecosystem services. As biological communities become more similar worldwide, they become more vulnerable to the same diseases and environmental changes. The resilience that comes from diversity is lost as similar organisms dominate everywhere. Modern agriculture provides a preview of what global biological homogenization might look like. A handful of crop species now provide the majority of human calories worldwide. These crops are highly productive under current conditions, but they're also vulnerable to diseases and environmental changes that could affect them simultaneously across the globe. The Irish potato famine provides a historical example of what can happen when agricultural systems lack diversity. Wild ecosystems are heading in the same direction as human influence favors the same types of organisms everywhere. Urban environments worldwide are dominated by similar sets of small, adaptable species, regardless of local evolutionary history. Agricultural landscapes support similar weedy species whether they're in North America, Europe, or Asia. Even natural areas increasingly support similar assemblages of small generalist species rather than the unique combinations that historically characterize different regions. This convergence towards similar biological communities worldwide represents one of the most profound changes in the history of life on Earth. For billions of years, evolution had been divergent, creating increasing biological diversity as species adapted to different environments, and geographic isolation allowed unique lineages to develop. Human influence is reversing this trend, creating convergent evolution on a global scale, as similar environmental pressures favor similar organisms everywhere. The psychological and cultural impacts of this homogenization are difficult to quantify, but deeply significant. Human cultures developed in intimate relationship with unique local ecosystems. Traditional knowledge systems, languages, and cultural practices often reflect detailed understanding of local plants and animals that are now disappearing. As biological communities become more similar worldwide, this cultural diversity is also threatened. Children growing up in different parts of the world increasingly encounter similar sets of urban-adapted species rather than the unique local wildlife that shaped their parents' and grandparents' experiences. This biological homogenization contributes to cultural homogenization as place-based ecological knowledge becomes less relevant and universal. Urban experiences become more important. The speed of these changes means that many traditional ecological relationships are being severed within single human lifetimes. Indigenous communities that maintain sustainable relationships with local ecosystems for thousands of years find themselves managing biological communities that bear little resemblance to what their ancestors knew. Traditional management practices that evolved over millennia may no longer be effective in ecosystems dominated by introduced species and altered by climate change. Even scientific understanding struggles to keep pace with the rate of change. Ecological studies that documented species interactions and ecosystem functions just decades ago may no longer be relevant as the systems they described have been fundamentally altered. Long-term research projects that were designed to understand natural processes increasingly find themselves documenting the transition from natural to human-dominated systems. This creates a crisis for evidence-based conservation. Many conservation strategies are based on understanding of how ecosystems functioned in the past. But these historical baselines may no longer be achievable or even relevant. Attempting to restore ecosystems to past conditions may be impossible when the species and environmental conditions that maintained those systems no longer exist. Novel ecosystem management represents an emerging approach that acknowledges this reality. Rather than trying to restore systems to historical states, novel ecosystem management focuses on maintaining ecosystem functions using whatever species are available, even if they're not the historical inhabitants of those areas. This pragmatic approach accepts that the goal is functional ecosystems, rather than historically accurate ones. But novel ecosystem management raises profound philosophical questions about what we're trying to conserve and why. If we accept that historical ecosystems cannot be restored, are we abandoning the goal of preserving natural heritage? If we manage ecosystems for function rather than historical accuracy, are we simply creating new forms of human-dominated landscapes rather than protecting nature? These questions become more urgent as the pace of change accelerates. Climate change projections suggest that within this century, many regions will experience environmental conditions that have no historical precedent. The species assemblages that could theoretically adapt to these conditions don't exist because they've never been tested by such environments. We're heading into ecological terra incognita, where past experience provides little guidance for future management. The downsizing of animal communities is both a symptom and a driver of this transition toward novel ecosystems. Smaller animals create different environmental conditions than larger ones, which favor different plant communities, which support different animal communities in an endless feedback loop of change. Once this process begins, it becomes self-reinforcing as each change makes return to previous conditions more difficult. Understanding this dynamic helps explain why ecosystem restoration is often so challenging. It's not enough to reintroduce missing species or remove invasive ones. The entire web of interactions that maintained historical systems may need to be rebuilt simultaneously, which is often practically impossible given the resources available for conservation. The scale of coordination required for ecosystem restoration at meaningful scales exceeds the capacity of any existing institution. Restoring landscape-level ecosystem functions would require cooperation across political boundaries, economic sectors, and cultural differences that have proven difficult to achieve even for much simpler conservation goals. The social and political challenges of large-scale restoration may be even more daunting than the ecological ones. Yet some regions are beginning to experiment with landscape-scale restoration that acknowledges these realities. The European Greenbelt Initiative attempts to restore ecosystem connectivity across the former Iron Curtain using a combination of rewilding, sustainable agriculture, and urban planning. Yellowstone to Yukon corridor projects try to maintain wildlife connectivity across one of North America's largest remaining wilderness areas. These initiatives represent new models for conservation that work with evolutionary and ecological processes rather than trying to freeze them in place. They accept that ecosystems will change and try to guide that change in directions that maintain biological diversity and ecosystem function. They recognize that the goal cannot be preserving the past, but rather ensuring that the future includes space for large animals and complex ecological relationships. The success of these landscape-scale initiatives will largely determine whether the downsizing of animal communities continues to its logical conclusion, or whether alternative trajectories remain possible. The window for such initiatives is closing rapidly as fragmentation increases and climate change accelerates. Once ecosystems pass certain thresholds of simplification, restoration becomes exponentially more difficult. But the potential rewards of successful restoration are enormous. Ecosystems with restored large animal populations provide dramatically more ecosystem services than simplified systems. They store more carbon, purify more water, and maintain more stable climate conditions. They support more biodiversity and provide more resilience against environmental changes. Most importantly, they offer hope that humans and large animals can coexist in ways that benefit both. The future of Earth's animals may depend on whether we can learn to see ourselves not as separate from nature, but as participants in ecological communities that we can either simplify or enrich through our choices. The great downsizing that began with the Pleistocene extinctions continues today, but it's not inevitable that it will continue indefinitely. We have the knowledge and technology to support large animal populations if we choose to make that a priority. The question is whether we will make that choice before the evolutionary and ecological momentum towards simplification becomes irreversible. The giants of the past are gone forever, but the future could still include giants if we act quickly and decisively to create the conditions they need to survive and thrive. The story of animal downsizing is still being written, and we are the authors of its next chapters. The acceleration of this downsizing process becomes even more apparent when we examine the fossil record with modern dating techniques. What scientists once assumed were gradual evolutionary changes spanning hundreds of thousands of years are now revealed to have occurred in timeframes that seem almost impossibly brief. Island populations of elephants that went from full-sized to pony-sized didn't take geological ages to shrink. They accomplished this transformation in less time than it takes for mountains to erode by measurable amounts. The precision of modern radiocarbon dating has revolutionized our understanding of these evolutionary timescales. When researchers examine elephant fossils from Mediterranean islands, they find clear evidence that some populations lost more than 60% of their body mass in fewer than 10,000 years. That's roughly 400 generations for an elephant lineage, which in evolutionary terms is practically instantaneous. The mechanisms driving such rapid change involve more than simple survival of the fittest. When animal populations face severe resource constraints, they experience what geneticists call evolutionary rescue scenarios. The individuals carrying genetic variants that promote smaller adult size suddenly find themselves with enormous survival advantages. These advantageous genes spread through populations at rates that would be impossible under normal circumstances. Modern molecular analysis has revealed the specific genetic pathways involved in these rapid size reductions. Many of the genes that regulate adult body size are master controllers that influence multiple developmental processes simultaneously. A single mutation in one of these regulatory genes can reduce adult size by 20% or more in a single generation. It's evolutionary change at the speed of ecological crisis. This same genetic architecture operates today in populations facing environmental stress. Urban bird populations show measurable size reductions within decades of city development. Fish in heavily harvested waters evolve smaller adult sizes faster than fisheries managers can adjust their regulations. Mammals in fragmented habitats undergo size changes that can be detected within human lifespans, rather than across geological epochs. But rapid evolutionary change comes with hidden costs that only become apparent over longer time frames. When populations evolve quickly in response to environmental stress, they typically lose genetic diversity in the process. The individuals that survive the initial bottleneck carry only a subset of the genetic variation that existed in the original population. This genetic impoverishment makes future adaptation more difficult and increases vulnerability to new environmental challenges. The fossil record preserves clear evidence of these evolutionary trade-offs. Island populations that successfully adapted to resource limitations through size reduction often show reduced genetic diversity compared to their mainland ancestors. While they survived the initial challenge of island life, many of these dwarfed populations eventually went extinct when faced with new stressors like climate change or the arrival of new predators. Modern conservation genetics reveals similar patterns in contemporary populations undergoing rapid size evolution. Urban animals that adapt quickly to city life often show reduced genetic diversity compared to their rural counterparts. Fish populations that evolve smaller sizes in response to fishing pressure lose the genetic basis for large body size and may be unable to recover even when fishing pressure is reduced. This creates what evolutionary biologists call an adaptation trap. The very changes that allow populations to survive immediate environmental challenges can reduce their long-term evolutionary potential. Species become locked into smaller sizes, not because small size is optimal, but because they've lost the genetic capacity to be larger. Climate change adds another layer of complexity to these evolutionary dynamics. As global temperatures rise and precipitation patterns shift, many animals face multiple environmental challenges simultaneously. They must adapt to changing temperatures while also dealing with habitat fragmentation, pollution, and direct human interference. The combination creates evolutionary pressures unlike anything preserved in the fossil record. Mountain-dwelling animals provide particularly clear examples of climate-driven evolutionary pressure. As temperature zones shift upward with warming climates, species adapted to high elevation conditions find their preferred habitats moving beyond the tops of mountains. They can't migrate higher indefinitely, and the lower elevations are often dominated by human activities that exclude native wildlife. The evolutionary response is predictable but troubling. Smaller body sizes allow animals to regulate temperature more effectively in warming conditions. Mountain mammals across multiple continents show measurable size reductions that correlate with rising temperatures over the past several decades. These aren't just individual animals losing weight due to environmental stress. These are genetic changes spreading through populations as smaller individuals prove more successful at surviving in altered conditions. Arctic environments demonstrate this climate-size relationship with startling clarity. The Arctic is warming at twice the global average, creating some of the most intense evolutionary pressure anywhere on Earth. Polar bears in regions where sea ice has declined most dramatically show measurably smaller average sizes than populations where ice persists longer. Caribou herds migrating across increasingly unreliable frozen surfaces favor smaller individuals less likely to break through weakened ice. Even Arctic foxes are evolving smaller sizes as their traditional prey species become less abundant and their food webs simplify. The changes are happening so rapidly that researchers can document evolutionary shifts within individual research careers rather than across multiple human generations. But Arctic downsizing represents more than just individual species adaptation. The loss of large Arctic animals creates feedback loops that accelerate climate change itself. Large herbivores like caribou and muskoxen help maintain grassland vegetation that reflects more sunlight than the shrubs and trees that replace them when grazing pressure is removed. Their trampling also compacts snow, reducing its insulating properties and helping keep permafrost frozen. As these large animals become smaller and less numerous, their ecosystem engineering effects diminish. Arctic landscapes become darker and more insulated, absorbing more solar energy and accelerating permafrost thaw. The downsizing of Arctic fauna thus contributes to the very climate changes that are driving their size reduction in the first place. Similar feedback loops operate in other environments facing rapid change. Tropical forests fragmenting due to human development create island-like conditions that favor smaller animals. But smaller animals provide less effective seed dispersal for large-seeded trees, accelerating forest fragmentation and creating even stronger pressure for size reduction. Marine environments show parallel dynamics as ocean chemistry changes due to increased atmospheric carbon dioxide. As seawater becomes more acidic, shell-building organisms face higher energy costs for maintaining their protective structures. Smaller shells require less energy to build and maintain, creating selection pressure for reduced size throughout marine food webs. The cumulative effect is oceans becoming dominated by smaller organisms at every level. Phytoplankton communities shift towards smaller species, better adapted to acidic conditions. Zooplankton follow their food source towards smaller sizes. Fish populations adapt to feed on smaller prey items. The entire marine ecosystem undergoes coordinated downsizing in response to human-altered ocean chemistry. These cascading size reductions have profound implications for ocean productivity and global climate regulation. Smaller marine organisms process carbon differently than larger ones. They typically have faster metabolisms but shorter lifespans, creating different patterns of carbon storage and release. The net effect may be oceans that remain biologically active, but function very differently in terms of global carbon cycling. Agricultural landscapes provide some of the most dramatic examples of human-driven evolutionary pressure for size reduction. Modern farming creates vast areas of simplified habitat where only the most adaptable species can survive. These environments strongly favor small, fast-reproducing animals that can exploit agricultural resources while avoiding human control measures. The evolutionary response has been rapid and consistent across different agricultural systems worldwide. Rodent populations in farming areas consistently evolve smaller sizes than their counterparts in natural habitats. Smaller rodents hide more effectively from predators and control efforts. They survive on smaller food caches and reproduce more quickly, allowing populations to recover rapidly from periodic management interventions. Agricultural birds show similar evolutionary patterns. Many farmland species have evolved smaller sizes that allow them to exploit crop resources more efficiently while avoiding detection by farmers. Smaller birds feed on smaller seeds and insects, making them less dependent on large prey items that modern agriculture often eliminates through pesticide use. The insects thriving in agricultural environments are almost exclusively small species, capable of completing rapid life cycles and hiding effectively from control measures. Large, slow-developing insects simply cannot survive in environments where habitats are regularly disturbed and food sources are treated with pesticides. Agricultural insect communities become dominated by small, weedy species rather than the diverse size classes that characterized pre-agricultural landscapes. These agricultural evolutionary pressures extend far beyond farm boundaries. Animals in natural areas adjacent to agricultural land often face similar selection pressures as farming practices affect water quality, air quality, and habitat connectivity across entire regions. The evolutionary effects of agriculture thus influence animal evolution across landscapes much larger than the farms themselves. Urban environments create even more extreme evolutionary pressure for size reduction. Cities represent the most intensive form of habitat modification that humans create, with nearly every aspect of the natural environment altered to serve human needs. The animals succeeding in urban environments must navigate concrete, glass, and steel, while avoiding vehicles, pollution, and active human management. Urban evolutionary responses have been remarkably consistent across different cities worldwide. Bird populations in urban environments show clear trends towards smaller body sizes compared to rural populations of the same species. Smaller birds maneuver more effectively in the complex three-dimensional environment that cities create. They exploit the smaller, more scattered food sources that urban environments provide. Urban mammals follow identical patterns. Raccoons, squirrels, and other city-adapted mammals consistently measure smaller in urban environments than in natural habitats. The fragmented nature of urban habitats favors animals that survive in small territories. The abundant but unpredictable food sources that cities provide favor animals that subsist on varied diets and smaller meal sizes. Even urban insects show rapid evolutionary responses to city life. Many urban insect populations have evolved smaller sizes within decades of urban development. The heat island effects that make cities warmer than surrounding areas favor smaller insects that dissipate heat more effectively. Artificial lighting creates novel selection pressures that often favor smaller species with different visual systems. The speed of urban evolution has surprised researchers studying city wildlife. What scientists assumed were fixed species, characteristics can change measurably within human lifespans as animal populations adapt to urban conditions. These changes represent genuine genetic evolution rather than simply individual responses to urban environments. But urban evolution involves trade-offs that limit long-term success. Urban environments typically lack the resources that large animals need to maintain complex social structures and sophisticated behaviors. Urban animals often show reduced cognitive abilities, simplified social behaviors, and elevated stress responses compared to their rural relatives. Noise and light pollution, characteristic of urban environments, create additional evolutionary pressures, indirectly favoring smaller sizes. Smaller animals typically produce higher frequency vocalizations that penetrate urban noise more effectively. They're also less disrupted by artificial lighting because smaller eyes are generally less sensitive to light pollution. Chemical pollution concentrating in urban environments also creates selection pressure for smaller body sizes. Toxins bioaccumulate in animal tissues, with larger animals typically accumulating higher concentrations due to their positions in food webs and longer lifespans. Smaller animals with faster metabolisms process and eliminate toxins more efficiently, providing survival advantages in polluted environments. Road mortality represents another urban pressure consistently favoring smaller animals. Large animals are more likely to be struck by vehicles simply because they present bigger targets and move more slowly across roads. Smaller animals dart across roads more quickly and are more likely to pass under vehicles without being struck. Over time, this creates strong selection pressure against large size in areas with heavy traffic. Urban habitat fragmentation also prevents the large territories that big animals require. Urban parks and green spaces, regardless of design quality, typically cannot support the space requirements of large mammals or birds. The animals thriving in cities are those completing entire life cycles within small, isolated habitat patches. These urban evolutionary pressures are particularly significant because urban environments are expanding rapidly worldwide. More than half the human population now lives in cities, with this proportion expected to reach 70% by mid-century. As urban areas expand, they create evolutionary pressure for size reduction across increasingly large portions of Earth's surface. The combined effects of climate change, habitat fragmentation, urbanization, and agricultural expansion create what biologists call a perfect storm for animal downsizing. Never before in Earth's history have so many different factors simultaneously favored smaller body sizes across so many different environments. The result is evolutionary pressure for size reduction that's both global in scope and unprecedented in intensity. This pressure proves particularly challenging because many factors driving downsizing operate simultaneously rather than sequentially. Animal populations might face climate change, habitat fragmentation, pollution, and direct human pressure all at once. The cumulative effect creates evolutionary scenarios far more challenging than anything preserved in the fossil record. Previous mass extinction events were typically followed by evolutionary radiations that eventually restored ecosystem complexity and large body sizes. But these recovery periods required millions of years and occurred in environments largely free of human influence. Modern animals face the challenge of adapting to human-dominated environments while simultaneously dealing with rapid climate change and habitat destruction. The question haunting conservation biologists is whether modern ecosystems can maintain basic functions with the simplified animal communities emerging from this evolutionary downsizing. Smaller animals provide different ecosystem services than larger ones. They process energy and nutrients at different rates, create different impacts on vegetation and soil, and support different parasite and disease communities. Early evidence suggests that while simplified ecosystems can remain functional, they operate at reduced capacity and with less stability than more complex systems. Grasslands maintained by small herbivores store less carbon than those maintained by large ones. Forests dispersed by small animals show less genetic diversity than those dispersed by large animals. Marine ecosystems dominated by small fish prove more vulnerable to environmental fluctuations than those with diverse size classes. These functional changes have direct implications for human welfare. Many ecosystem services that human societies depend on are provided more effectively by large animals than small ones. Carbon storage, water purification, soil formation, and pest control all depend on ecological processes enhanced by animal size diversity. As animal communities become dominated by smaller species, their capacity to provide these services diminishes. The economic costs of this functional simplification are only beginning to be calculated. Replacing natural pest control with chemical pesticides costs billions of dollars annually. Replacing natural pollination with artificial methods proves even more expensive. Replacing natural carbon storage with technological solutions appears prohibitively costly. Yet these become necessary substitutions as the animals providing these services naturally become smaller and less capable. Some conservation efforts are beginning to recognize the importance of maintaining large animals not just for intrinsic value, but for ecosystem services they provide. Rewilding projects that reintroduce large herbivores to degraded landscapes often show rapid improvements in ecosystem function. Protected areas maintaining viable populations of large animals consistently outperform those dominated by smaller species in ecosystem service provision. But these conservation successes remain small islands in a sea of ongoing downsizing. The global forces driving animal size reduction continue to intensify. Climate change accelerates, habitat fragmentation expands, urban development consumes natural areas at unprecedented rates. The evolutionary pressure for smaller sizes shows no signs of abating. Understanding this process helps us recognize what we're witnessing as more than individual species conservation challenges. We're observing a fundamental transformation of how life on Earth is organized. The age of giants that characterized our planet for most of its history is giving way to an age of adaptation, where success is measured not by size or power, but by ability to survive in an increasingly human-dominated world. This transformation raises profound questions about what kind of planet we want to inhabit, and what natural heritage we want to leave for future generations. The animals that remain are increasingly those that can tolerate or even thrive alongside human activities. They're often intelligent, adaptable, and resilient, but they're also smaller, simpler, and less ecologically impactful than their predecessors. The choice we face isn't whether this downsizing will continue. The evolutionary pressures are too strong and widespread to reverse completely. The choice is whether we'll take conscious action to preserve refugia where larger animals can persist, or whether we'll simply accept a world where biological grandeur becomes increasingly rare. The story of shrinking animals ultimately becomes a story about choices. Every day, through individual and collective actions, we decide what kind of world we want to live in and what kind of world we'll leave for future generations. The giants of the past are gone forever, but the fate of today's large animals still hangs in the balance, shaped by decisions we make about how we want to share our planet with the other species that call it home. The story becomes even more personal when we realize that this transformation isn't just happening to anonymous species in distant places. It's reshaping the very animals we see outside our windows, the creatures that share our neighborhoods, and the wildlife that our children will grow up knowing. The baseline for what we consider normal animal sizes has shifted so dramatically that most people have no idea how much larger the animals around them used to be. Take white-tailed deer, for instance. These animals are often considered a suburban nuisance today, but the deer browsing in your backyard are measurably smaller than their ancestors from just a century ago. Urban and suburban deer populations consistently show reduced body sizes compared to their rural counterparts. The fragmented landscapes of suburban development create resource limitations that mirror the island environments where dwarfism evolved over much longer timescales. The changes aren't subtle. Deer living in suburban environments show shorter leg bones, smaller skull measurements, and reduced overall body mass. Their antlers grow smaller, their reproductive output decreases, and their lifespans shorten. Within just a few decades, these populations have undergone evolutionary changes that would normally take thousands of years to accumulate. Similar patterns appear in bird populations across developed landscapes. House finches introduced to urban environments in North America have evolved measurably smaller body sizes within 50 years of establishment. Cliff swallows, nesting under highway overpasses, have developed shorter wings that allow tighter turns, helping them avoid vehicle strikes. These aren't learned behaviors passed from parent to offspring. These are genetic changes spreading through populations faster than anyone thought evolution could operate. The speed of these transformations challenges fundamental assumptions about evolutionary timescales. Darwin's gradual view of evolution suggested that major biological changes required countless generations and vast stretches of time. But when environmental pressures become intense enough, evolution can shift into overdrive, producing dramatic changes within lifespans that humans can directly observe. Modern technology has allowed scientists to track these rapid changes with unprecedented precision. DNA analysis reveals population bottlenecks and genetic shifts associated with size reduction. Museum collections provide baseline measurements from decades past that can be compared with contemporary populations. Even growth rings in animal bones preserve records of how environmental conditions affected individual organisms across their lifetimes. The implications extend far beyond academic curiosity. These rapid evolutionary changes represent early warning signs of broader ecological transformations. When animals begin evolving smaller sizes in response to human activities, it signals that environmental pressures have crossed critical thresholds. The changes we can measure in animal populations today predict larger ecosystem shifts that may not become apparent for decades. Climate change accelerates these processes in ways that compound other human impacts. Rising temperatures don't just stress individual animals, they create evolutionary pressure for smaller body sizes across entire regions. The temperature size rule that governs animal physiology becomes a driver of evolutionary change, as warming conditions favor individuals that can dissipate heat more effectively. Research across multiple continents has documented consistent decreases in body size corresponding to warming temperatures over recent decades. Arctic animals provide particularly dramatic examples. Polar bears measured today are significantly smaller than those measured in the 1980s. Caribou herds show declining average weights across their entire range. Even Arctic foxes are shrinking as their icy habitat transforms into something more temperate. These changes cascade through entire food webs in ways that amplify their effects. When primary consumers become smaller, the predators that depend on them face altered hunting strategies and reduced energy returns. Smaller prey items provide less nutrition per capture, forcing predators to hunt more frequently or switch to different prey species entirely. The energetic mathematics of these relationships are unforgiving. A predator evolved to hunt large prey cannot simply switch to hunting many small prey items and maintain the same energy balance. The time and energy costs of finding and capturing multiple small prey often exceed the energy gained, creating what ecologists call an energetic trap. Many large predators face exactly this scenario, as their traditional prey species shrink or disappear entirely. Arctic wolves that once hunted massive caribou now pursue smaller prey across longer distances. Mountain lions adapted to hunting large deer find themselves in territories where only smaller prey remains available. These predators must either adapt to new hunting strategies or face population decline. The adaptation isn't always successful. Large predators have evolved sophisticated hunting techniques optimized for specific prey sizes and behaviors. Changing these strategies requires not just individual learning, but evolutionary changes in morphology, physiology, and behavior. The timeframes required for such adaptations often exceed the speed at which environmental conditions are changing. Ocean environments demonstrate these predator-prey mismatches with particular clarity. As fish populations evolve smaller average sizes in response to intensive harvesting, the marine predators that depend on them struggle to adapt. Seabirds that evolve to catch large fish find their hunting success declining as their traditional prey becomes scarce. The nutritional quality of prey also changes as animals become smaller. Smaller animals typically have different body compositions than larger ones, with higher surface area to volume ratios that affect their fat content and energy density. Predators adapted to extracting maximum nutrition from large prey items may find smaller prey less rewarding, even when they can catch them successfully. These nutritional mismatches create subtle but important effects on predator reproduction and survival. Seabirds feeding on smaller fish often show reduced breeding success because they cannot provide adequate nutrition for their chicks. Marine mammals hunting smaller prey may spend more time foraging and less time resting or socializing, affecting their overall health and reproductive output. The changes ripple through entire ocean ecosystems as these nutritional relationships become disrupted. Marine food webs that evolved around specific size relationships between predators and prey must reorganize as those relationships break down. The result is simplified marine communities with fewer species filling fewer ecological roles. Terrestrial environments show parallel disruptions as land animals undergo size reduction in response to habitat fragmentation and climate change. Forest ecosystems that developed around specific relationships between large herbivores and the plants they browsed must adapt as those herbivores become smaller and less capable of creating the disturbance patterns that many plant species require. Large herbivores function as ecosystem engineers, creating clearings, trampling paths, and distributing nutrients across landscapes through their movements. When these animals become smaller, their engineering effects diminish proportionally. Forests that depend on large animal disturbance begin to change composition as gap dynamics and nutrient cycling patterns shift. The seed dispersal networks that connect forest patches also suffer as their key species shrink. Many trees evolved fruits, specifically sized for consumption by large animals. As these dispersers become smaller or disappear entirely, the trees face reproductive isolation that reduces genetic diversity and limits their ability to colonize new areas. Plant communities respond to these changes with their own evolutionary adaptations, but plants typically evolve much more slowly than animals. The mismatch between rapidly changing animal communities and slowly adapting plant communities creates novel ecological situations with unpredictable outcomes. Some plants show signs of evolutionary orphaning, where their dispersal strategies become obsolete as their animal partners disappear. Avocados represent a famous example of this phenomenon. Their large seeds and rich flesh evolved for consumption by megafauna that no longer exist. Without human intervention, avocados would likely go extinct within centuries, as their dispersal strategy fails in the absence of appropriate animal partners. Many other plants face similar fates, as their animal partners shrink below the size thresholds necessary for effective seed dispersal. Honey locust trees in North America produce massive seed pods protected by fierce thorns and filled with sweet pulp, clearly designed for consumption by large animals. No modern North American animal can effectively disperse honey locust seeds, leaving these trees as evolutionary relicts, slowly declining without their vanished partners. The loss of these plant-animal partnerships represents a form of ecological debt that accumulates over time. Forests may appear healthy for decades after losing their large animal dispersers, but they're actually living on borrowed time. As existing trees age and die without successful reproduction, entire plant communities may collapse suddenly when their evolutionary debts come due. Modern conservation efforts often focus on preserving existing species without recognizing these hidden vulnerabilities. Protected areas that seem to maintain intact ecosystems may actually be preserving systems that are fundamentally unstable without the large animals that once maintained them. Understanding these dynamics has led some conservation biologists to advocate for functional restoration rather than simple species preservation. This approach recognizes that ecosystems cannot be preserved in their current states if those states depend on ecological relationships that have been severed by the loss of large animals. The transformation we've witnessed isn't just a chapter in natural history. It's the story of our planet's present and future unfolding in real time. From the mammoth steppes of the Pleistocene to the fragmented landscapes outside your window, we've traced a pattern of downsizing that connects ancient extinctions to modern evolution, revealing how profoundly we've reshaped the very essence of life on Earth. The giants are gone, and they're not coming back. But their absence echoes through every ecosystem, every food web, every relationship between predator and prey, plant and disperser, engineer and environment. We're living in the shadow of titans, inheriting a world that's still adjusting to their disappearance, still simplifying, still shrinking towards something smaller and more manageable, but infinitely less magnificent. Yet this story isn't over. The downsizing continues today, at unprecedented speed, but it's not unstoppable. Every choice we make about how we share this planet shapes the trajectory of this transformation. We can continue down this path toward an increasingly simplified world, or we can choose to preserve spaces where biological grandeur can persist and perhaps even recover. The next time you step outside, take a moment to really look at the animals around you. Know that they're smaller than their ancestors, living in a world more constrained than anything their lineages had known for millions of years. But also know that their survival represents resilience, adaptation, and the endless creativity of life, finding ways to persist even as the rules of existence keep changing. We are the authors of this ongoing story, the architects of tomorrow's ecosystems. The question that remains is what kind of world we'll choose to write into existence.